Julia, it's nice to see you. We're experimenting with something new here, which is we've been saying for a long time, wouldn't it be great if we had like a short spot every week where we talked about Medicaid data together, like we do together all the time, but we did it in a more public way.
So
So
exciting.
exciting. So we're going to try this. If anyone has Medicaid data topics that they want to hear about, shoot them our way. But the first one that we're trialing is medical frailty because it's like big in the news this week, and it's a huge Medicaid data topic.
Very big, very big.
So Julia, why do we care about medical frailty? Like why is this like, if you're a data nerd, like why is this such a big topic?
Well, maybe to take half a step back. So as a part of the Working Families tax credit legislation, there are new Medicaid work requirements. And so if somebody is a part of the adult expansion group, they now have to participate in some form of community engagement. And so as a part of that, there are some exemptions or exclusions. And if somebody has one of those, they do not have to participate or they're excluded from the program. So medical frailty is one of those exclusions. So if somebody is medically frail, they are excluded from these work requirements. Ultimately, these definitions come down to data. So states are required to really determine if somebody meets these criteria with the data that they have in hand or on kind of an ex parte basis. So if they have the data, they should be able to use the data to see if somebody meets criteria from those exclusions or for those exclusions. So there's been a ton of attention on how do you do this? How do you use the data? How do you define these different kinds of conditions? What makes somebody medically frail? So it's very interesting and very hard. Like it is easy maybe to say, here are the conditions that you would consider to be medically frail or make somebody considered to have medical frailty. But figuring out how to actually see those in the data and use them is very hard.
Yeah, and we've been talking about this a lot. Like, so if you're in the circles that we are over the last couple of months, like this has been a big topic, right? Like, what populations are included? What data sets do you use to find them in your populations, right? All on this premise that like other exemptions within the community engagement requirement are maybe a little straightforward to define, but this was a one that was like, there was no standard definition that went with it, right? And so you have every state right now that's been thinking about this in a slightly different permutation in a different way, which brings us to the interim rule that dropped this week. So tell us about the interim rule, like knowing that everyone's been talking about this, everyone's been thinking about like, how do I define medical frailty? How do I find these patients in the populations in the data that I have? So this interim rule drops, not unexpected, but like, what does it tell us?
So the interim rule dropped on June 1st. We knew it was coming by way of timing. So rule drops June 1st. States have to implement this by December 31st, end of this year, January 1st, 2027. And that is a very, very short window to make a bunch of massive changes to comply with this new law. And as a result of that, states have like really had to get started before they saw the rule. So this was a big moment of like, has all of the work that I've been doing, is it aligned with this new rule? Are there things that are in there that we weren't expecting? And I think the big bombshell of this rule is that it explicitly ties this definition of medical frailty to the community engagement requirement. So what I mean by that is that someone can only be excluded on the basis of medical frailty if their condition significantly impairs their ability to comply with these work requirements. So if they are medically frail, it has to impact their ability to work or engage with some of these other qualifying activities. So as a data nerd, the question then becomes, well, how can states actually establish that with the data that they have in hand? And so there are some conditions that the law explicitly calls out saying this is sufficient on their own. We are not going to be exhaustive, like states will have to figure this out, which conditions meet the mark, but cancer, end-stage renal disease, HIV/AIDS, if you see somebody in your data that says that they have one of these conditions, that's sufficient. But then they also called out some other conditions that they said on their own are not sufficient: asthma, hypertension, diabetes. And so for these ones, how can you tell if somebody is sick enough or impacted in a way that really affects their ability to comply with the data that you have? So this is going to be really hard, and this is what states are really going to have to grapple with. And then The other piece that I think was pretty surprising is that there was some clear guidance that states can only use 1 year of historical data to see if somebody is frail. So if they're medically frail. So I think there was a lot of experimentation going around of like, how far back is the first claim that we see that says that somebody has end-stage renal disease or HIV/AIDS. So these are the kinds of things that I think are a bit surprising. And we'll see kind of how states are going to be able to handle that.
Yeah. So just to make sure, like I'm fully following and to
Yeah.
recap some of what I've been hearing too, right? I mean, I think this is interesting because it ties in with this broader theme we're seeing of, Medicaid is a state administered program, right? With like federal oversight. And what's interesting about this, right, is like CMS is putting a stake in the ground and saying, we are defining this concept, right, that you all have been iterating on, right, within your states over some period. And there's been a lot of chatter in general about like why this might happen, but when you have a bunch of vendors, right, who are working in states, and I used to work on the vendor side, if you're trying to create something different for every state, that's expensive, right? And it takes time. And so I think there's been some initiative to say, hey, like let's try to coordinate these things so that everyone's rolling out the same technology, right? And we can do it in a short window and it's more cost effective. But I think what you're pointing out here is that inherently, right, that creates this more restrictive definition, right, that everyone's trying to hew to. And there's a lot more, variability, right, in that space between like what is in the CMS definition and what states might have been thinking they could include in their definition, right? And so I just want to double click on that for one more like click, because you mentioned some of the populations where it's like, okay, these are clearly here's some places where people might have been expecting to include folks from, can you name a couple of those too, where I think there were some surprises, like a little bit of I thought you're hearing states say, hey, I think I can include this population, and then that population didn't show up in this interim rule.
Well, I think one thing that's really interesting, so some of the examples I gave, diabetes is one. When you look, medical frailty isn't really a new concept to the Medicaid program. And so I think where states were starting from was, let's look at the other places within Medicaid where we have had to define this population before. And what does that look like? What conditions are part of that? Diabetes is in every single one. And I think the big thing here is that, and it says this explicitly in the final rule, the place where we have seen this historically is with alternative benefit plans. And so within Medicaid, if your state has these alternative benefit plans, if somebody has shown that they are medically frail, they can choose whether they want one of those plans or if they want kind of a traditional Medicaid plan. So in those states, they define medical frailty and they say, okay, if you have it, you can pick your plan. And so in this rule, it's saying we're gonna have a different definition. And the reason for that is that what you're doing with these alternative benefit plans is you're picking a plan. And in this case, what you're doing is you're showing that you have to comply with these community engagement requirements. So we don't have this, like, this is a different program, we're not going to have the same definition. And so I think many of the conditions that we see in the definitions, and these definitions that states have historically had, vary. They're very different from state to state, but there are some conditions like diabetes that are consistent. Those are some of the ones that are explicitly called out in this law as not being enough on their own to demonstrate that you should be excluded.
So I think we had said we were going to do this in 5 minutes, and clearly Julie and I could just talk about data endlessly. This could be a 5-hour podcast. Tell us, I would love to click into the data types, right? Like because this is where it gets interesting from a data perspective, and also knowing there's limited time, right? And we know a lot of states are thinking about, do I just do a test to this in the first year? Yeah. Then there's many data sources behind the scenes, right, that states can be using, right? And when you start talking about layering in additional justification, right, it raises those questions. Was CMS at all prescriptive in this rule around the type of data that states are using? Were they restrictive in that way? Or like tell us more from a data perspective, like how some of this is, like you see how some of this playing out.
Yeah, there is some language in there that is specific around if you're going to be determining, you have to be determining medical frailty on an ex parte basis when you can. And when you are going to do that, you should be using your claims, you should be using your encounter data. Those data are not inherently very good at telling you how much impairment someone is experiencing. And so this leaves open the question of, If it's not one of those conditions that clearly impairs your ability to work, it's one of those conditions that's kind of in this middle ground, the claims may not be enough to tell us, and it may not be enough for a state to feel like if they're audited, they can say with clarity that this person is medically frail. And so when that happens, there are other options that they can use to verify if somebody's medically frail. Physician documentation is one of those. And I think the reality is what this may mean for beneficiaries is that there is less ability to use the data to do this on an ex parte basis, and they will have to work with their doctors and get that documentation much more frequently than we might have anticipated.
What should I have asked that I didn't? Anything else on this topic that's percolating, knowing that this has been a big topic of conversation for folks this week?
Not that I can think of. I think, our not 5-minute got pretty deep pretty quick.
Well, we're going to trial this. If folks have other topics they want us to take on, please do. We love talking about Medicaid data. Yeah, and we're going to trial this again next week. Thanks, Julia.
See you, Marie.